Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Diana and I are continuing our conversation on narrative design. Today, we're talking about dialogue. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody. Diana and I are continuing our conversation on narrative design. Today, we're going to be talking about dialogue. At the beginning of this series, we talked about the difference between content design and system design. And this is the first video that we're really diving into system design, which is where dialogue plays a part at. And that essentially means this is what we're creating that is reactionary to what the players are doing within your TTRPG. But before we dive into the full of it, Diana, why don't you start us off and tell us what dialogue is? Why is it important?
Dialogue is probably one of my favorite parts about writing anything, whether it's my own stuff or whether it's, like the actual narrative design of, gaming or helping somebody else create their world, to world build. Dialogue is literally just the communication between characters. And it can do so many different things. It gives you, not only does it give you that different voice to listen to, so you're hearing some aspect of the story without it just sounding like it's coming from a narrator. I'm okay. You know what I'm trying to say. But it shows how a character can relate to, the person playing, to the gamer. It can enhance things, like the theme or the mood of a scene. It can move a plot along depending on how you're using that dialogue. But it is the actual interactions, the communication between the characters.
Yeah, and to be clear, when you're talking about communication, you're not just talking about the verbal speech that's being exchanged back and forth. We're looking at nonverbal behavior here too that has to be taken into consideration when you're creating dialogue between characters.
Oh yeah, body language is a thing too, and you can describe body language in in what the character is doing throughout that dialogue as well.
Mm-hmm. This is a challenge in TTRPGs because unlike book writing or maybe video games where this is kind of systematic and rigorous, you as the GM are having to be responsive to what your players are doing so that you have dialogue that is appropriate to whatever their responses are. You may have some maybe pre-made idea of like who your NPCs are, what their nonverbals are like, how they speak with their cadence and their tone and their volume. Maybe they have an accent, how quick they are to anger, maybe if they stand too close in proximity or too far away. You may have all these ideas about who the character is and how their communication comes across, but you also have to be responsive to the players around the table and how they're engaging with that NPC.
Yeah, so it makes sense. It's got to make sense with with the environment as well, depending on, if you're in, say, a town where you have kind of like, some bad renown or something versus where you're seen as some sort of, just a stranger, somebody who's just coming through and everybody's kind of wary. It's important to make sure that your dialogue is going to match up so that the player and reader, whoever, is going to remain in the story.
Yeah, I would agree with you. If your character starts doing things or your NPC starts doing things that are out of sorts with the environment, it's going to pull your players right out of the story. They're no longer going to be immersed within that. So, what things do you consider when you're creating dialogue? Let's say that you are having to have, there's some important information that this NPC has to deliver. So, how do you go about creating that to make sure that it has that realistic feel to it?
Really, I always start with the personality, and it's sort of like a mini backstory of the person who, I'm writing the dialogue for. I want to know what it is that kind of drives them, or, whether they are suspicious of who they're talking to, or whether they are, that friendly, type of person. But honestly, that's kind of where I start, is the personality, the little bit of backstory. How open is this character going to be? How big is their vocabulary going to be, depending on what kind of part they play in their world? Are they some sort of like academic, type of person? Are they a wizard? Are they, just a blacksmith? Depending on their, I guess, education level or something.
Just a blacksmith. You know how hard it is to make swords? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, they don't talk a whole lot in their work, really. That's what I'm trying to say. But I always I think start with that kind of like to understand the emotional state of the person that is having the dialogue, because the emotional state is what is going to connect to the player or the reader.
Yeah, I agree. I think having motivations behind the character and knowing where they're coming from is extremely important, especially so you can respond to the players in a way that's going to keep everything going in one direction, especially when you're in the course of like role playing in the midst of gameplay. If your
Mm-hmm.
character suddenly goes from speaking as a simpleton might to immediately going to an academic level of explaining, the warring nations that are occurring and the politics in between might be very confusing for your players. And at the same time, I see GMs oftentimes struggle where you have a player that just becomes the quest giver. Like you just come to town and he just hands out quests like whatever, cigarettes, at the barn behind the school. He's just like passing them out left and right. Like he doesn't have a family or ambitions of his own or anything. He's like, oh yeah, just come and see me and I'll just keep giving you quests all day long every day. So you want to build some structure around who they are and have that play into their communication style.
Which I think is, I mean, it's super important when it comes to things, like speech patterns and, like I guess not necessarily, I guess, would that be considered nonverbal, the speech patterns, because it's not actually what they're saying, it's how they're saying it.
Yeah, it's their
But anyways,
paraverbal. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. I think it's super important with TTRPGs when your GM is, unless they're in costume, switching costumes every time they're, playing that next
Mm-hmm.
character or moving from the tavern, guy to the blacksmith or something. I think that's where, people need to kind of keep in mind why dialogue is so important and
Mm-hmm.
why all the different aspects is so important because you can't go into costume. You're standing there in front of, your people or online on camera or whatever. Or even if it is written out, you can still gauge who is talking without having to always, add the dialogue tags, which is not in TTRPGs.
Yeah,
But
I would agree with you, and I know this is a skill to be developed, especially if you're not really accustomed to role playing. But you don't have to necessarily use voices all the time. John uses a different accent for every race of characters in our games, and so you know who's speaking, whether or not it's a French accent or an Australian accent or he's Scottish. Like you're like, oh, it's the French. It must be the halflings who've come to town, but. I don't know why he chooses the halflings to be French, but if you're not good at those types of things, you can change things like your cadence and your
mhm,
tone without doing really fancy voices. You can have your typical barbarian talk really slow when he's sharing
mhm.
information, and then you can have your no, he's talking really really fast and telling you everything you need to know. And you don't have to actually have a voice. You can just change the way that they're addressing it and they know who's speaking within that room without having to add that tag on
Mhm.
to them.
Yeah, that's a lot of what I do when I'm reading to our youngest. And so I found that as long as I'm doing the voices right or
Mm-hmm.
changing, even the cadence because I can't do accents. Um, but there's a lot less of wait, who's talking now? Wait, who said that?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's kind of it's one way that can be approached when it comes to something like a TTRPG is kind of like, you're reading the story or you're telling the story to, the people. But yeah, I think that's something that should really be kind of I think it's important to not think that you have to do accents well. That's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to say.
Which is true. Hey, by the way, if you guys are enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a comment down below, hit the little bell so you know when the next video comes out. And I'd like to kind of break some of this down now moving forward to just like the basic layout of what you might do in creating dialogue. And in my mind, in just kind of running through what we've already talked about, the first thing you're going to do is identify who the NPC is and what their motivations
Mhm.
are or what their emotionality is or their characteristics are. So you kind of have a blueprint of who they are. Then you're probably going to piece together some important dialogue information that they're meant to give to the characters. This is like when you go to your quest giver, God forbid, in a video game, and he just keeps repeating to you the same parroted information over and over again, and you can't get past it until you go and complete that. Like, what are those little tag things that they have to say that they're supposed to deliver one way or another? And then after that, it's just recognizing specific things about his communication. What are his nonverbals? What is his cadence? What is his tone? How close in proximity does he stand? Does he have an accent? What things do you want to add on to him to bring him to life? And with those things, those three things, I think that you're then able to be responsive in game as an NPC to however your characters are going to interact with him.
Yeah, that's right. I don't even know what to add to that.
That's fine. Anything else, I guess, just in tips of what you think that people need to be aware of when they are piecing together dialogue or piecing together communication for their characters. And again, guys, this is like system design stuff. This is being responsive in game.
I honestly, and I know I go back to emotion a lot, but especially with dialogue, emotion is something to keep in mind, because that's going to make the dialogue more realistic and, keep the listener or the gamer or the reader more intrigued and immersed in the story. I think when it comes to dialogue and emotion kind of come hand in hand so that you can make it as realistic as possible.
And you mentioned something earlier that I think really plays into that, the type of language that they use. If they're using, really harsh verbs, if they speak with a lot of nouns, if you change up the syntax of their sentences, a lot of that will play into, I think, how they come across in terms of their emotionality. If we think of famous characters within stories that have dialogue, whether it's Yoda, he inverses it and it makes him sound like he's as though he's very, very wise, which kind of gives this different, sense of who he is as a character, where you may come across somebody else that has a very direct, rash way of speaking that gives you a different impersonation of their body. For some reason, I'm thinking of Dobby and like his weak, small words that he uses and like his meek voice and how he speaks. And you immediately have a sense of his character because of how he engages with you.
Yeah, it's funny you went from Yoda to Dobby as if you can't see that connection.
That is true. They're probably long distant relatives in a galaxy far, far away. All right, well, that's all I have for you guys today. Anything else you want to add, Diana?
Nope, I think we covered it.
All right, let us know what else you would like for us to talk about, and we will see you all next time.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
What's your name? Diana and I. Am I even using that language right? What the hell am I saying, Diana?